Welcome to our third and final day of this fascinating three-day conference organized by UNAM, the National Autonomous University of Mexico, Boston University, and right here at UMass Boston. Name of our conference is the second colloquium in African Studies, and our sub-theme is inequality, migration, security in the African world. We've got a full day of exciting panels and speakers once again. And this morning, we are joined by our keynote speaker, Dr. Gilbert Khadiagala, who joins us all the way from South Africa. Let me tell you a few things about Dr. Khadiagala. I'm really proud to be reconnected with him while he was the director of the African Studies Center at Johns Hopkins several years ago and left us to go to South Africa. We miss him dearly, but we're glad that we can reconnect with him through forums like this. Dr. Khadiagala is currently the Jan Smuts Professor of International Relations, and he is the director of the Center for the Study of the United States at the University of Witwatersrand. I never pronounced that name. Wits, you call it. Now, yeah. Gilbert, tell me how to pronounce Witwatersrand. Is it Witwatersrand?
Wits.
Okay, you don't pronounce the W. It's Wits. Okay, Wits. In Johannesburg, in South Africa. He has previously taught comparative politics, African politics, international relations in Kenya, in Canada, and in the United States. And just before you joined us, he was telling us about his many visits to all parts of Mexico. So he's traveled the world. Professor Khadiagala holds a doctoral degree in international studies from the Paul Nitz School of Advanced International Studies, SAIS, at Johns Hopkins University in Washington, D.C. He is the recent editor of War and Peace in Africa's Great Lakes region, and that was published by Palgrave, 2017. He is the famous author. Anyone who studies African politics has to use his books on African foreign policy. And he has books on regional cooperation and democratization and conflict management in Africa, published by Carnegie. We are really pleased to have Professor Dr. Khadiagala here with us today. The title of his keynote address captures the themes of this conference. The title is African Ideas from a Transcontinental Perspective, contributions of the late Thandika Nkandawire. May he rest in peace. Go ahead, Dr. Gilbert.
Thank you, Kiki. Very much to see you again. And good morning and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Very privileged to have been invited to the colloquium. And since last year, I've been negotiating with Arturo about the topic that I was going to present on. And at the beginning, I thought probably I'll just look at trans-African, transcontinental, trans-regional ideas, particularly in revisiting the old debates about the role of the global African, the ideas around Pan-Africanism from a transcontinental perspective. But then what happened last year, March last year, actually, a day from tomorrow, a year from tomorrow, the Malawian economist Thandika Nkandawire passed on. And since then, I've been trying to do some research on his work. And that's what preliminarily my discussion is going to focus on, Khandawire's contribution to what I'm calling African ideas from a global transcontinental perspective. The work, the research is very preliminary. So I think as we go on, I think at the very end, if there are big questions to raise, those questions will really be helpful to my work going forward. So the way I divided the presentation, next slide, Kiki. I will first of all introduce what are the main themes of my presentation, with just a single slide on understanding transcontinental ideas. And then I'll put that in the context of what I'm calling the rise and decline of post-colonial thinking in Africa. After I look at the decline and the rise of post-colonial thinking in Africa, and then I'll begin to focus more frontally on Khandawire's political ideas. And then I'll have a final few slides on the meaning of Khandawire's ideas in the context of where do we go from here in terms of the production of knowledge by African intellectuals or by African thinkers. The interest here, therefore, is to say that ideas produced in Africa have always enriched the global knowledge base on the human condition, on human dignity, prosperity, self-determination, and self-reliance. And so we have, as Africa, being part of the global context, we've always been interested in ideas that inform how to make a better Africa, how to make a more dignified and a more self-reliant Africa. So this celebration, therefore, celebrates one of Africa's intellectuals, the Malawian scholar Khandawire, who died on March 27th last year. And I'm doing research on his contribution to African ideas that are framed in universal terms of regeneration, emancipation, and development. And then my main message here is that, in fact, over the years, there has been what I call the decline of African post-colonial, African philosophic thinking. That decline, therefore, opened room for the emergence of intellectuals in Africa, such as Samir Amin, who also just died last year, but also Khandawire, new thinkers, new scholars taking the place of the old African thinkers that I'll be talking about in a second. So I'm applauding the contributions of people like Samir Amin and Khandawire, because I look at their work as contributing to the general core of knowledge around the African condition, but also the global condition. So I think Khandawire, therefore, is important in the production of African ideas that have global resonance and global relevance. Next slide, please. I segue quickly into what I understand by transcontinental ideas. And I think my point here is that the notion of transcontinentalism is very broad across the social sciences, across the natural sciences, especially used by geographers and so on, but also in comparative literature. But I think for my purpose, I decided to take a few liberties and simply define transcontinental ideas as those ideas, those narratives that connect continents, that link the territorial spaces called continents. But also these ideas are important because they resonate across those continents. Secondly, I think I look at transcontinental ideas as ideas that inspire social movements, that inspire contentious action. So this is within the broader rubric of how do ideas get created, how do they get articulated across continents, and what we hold constant about these ideas, even as we celebrate their continentality. I also look at transcontinental ideas as ideas that invoke the language of universalism, but at the same time, they remain embedded in local knowledge and local understanding. And I'll come back to this theme when I look at Mkandawira in particular. How does he blend the universal and the local in trying to promote an understanding of what is Africa's place in the world? So the next slide looks at what I call the post-colonial thinking that inspired most of what was important in African ideas in the 60s, let's say from the 50s into the 80s. One of my colleagues here has just produced a book called The Pantheon of Pan-Africanism, looking at prophets, poets, and philosophers. And it just came out last year. What it does is that it reflects on the richness and the vibrant tradition of transcontinental African thinking by scholars and statesmen, ranging from Edward Blyden, and my chapter in this book is actually on Edward Blyden, through scholars such as Leopold Senghor, until much more recently through singers like Miriam Makeba, the celebrated South African singer. So the book captures the whole array of what I call African ideas, from literature to the arts, to politics, about the African condition. In this genre of writing, what I call the post-colonial writing, you have African statesmen and theorists such as Nkrumah, Nyerere, Senghor, Modibo Keita, Amilcar Cabral, among others, reflecting variously on the African condition, the vision of independence and unity, and the parameters of African emancipation, the whole array of discussions around what is Africa's place in the global order. Despite their diversity, these ideas shared a very common purpose, a notion of African agency, but also more important, a notion of African efficacy in the transformation of the continent. And as I said, they are African, but they are also very global ideas that we associate with post-colonial thinking. Next slide. By the early 80s, however, I think what I'm calling the post-colonial ideas were in what I'm describing as a progressive decline, creating a very huge vacuum in the production of ideas. And this is a vacuum that persists up to today. So the interesting question that I ask is, why did these ideas decline? Because they are important ideas. They were powerful ideas. But we see their decline over the years. And so we have to quibble about why they in fact declined. So I think the first explanation I offer for the decline is, in fact, the death of African philosopher kings. Ali Mazrui, again, who died about 5 years ago, is the one who described the African statesmen, the African thinkers of the 60s and 70s as the philosopher king. He says, in fact, when they began to die, there were no replacements. The ideas emanating from these scholars and these statements had very short lifespans, particularly in the context where they really found no firm grounding. And I have a quotation there from Julius Nyerere in Tanzania in 1975, lamenting about trying to build socialism, or African socialism as he called it, without very many socialists around him. And I'm just using that to demonstrate the predicament where you had thinkers with very strong and very good ideas, but when they begin to die, nobody is actually there to take over these ideas. And therefore, the second explanation is that these ideas were declining because of the inability of generational production of ideas. And this relates to the fact that the successors of these statesmen have not done much thinking. And this is Africa-wide, that there are no real new big ideas as we saw in the 60s or the 50s and the 70s. And it's an interesting topic to pose why the new leaders are not as critical thinkers as the old thinkers. But I don't think that's an issue I want to raise now. I'm just pointing to one of the predicaments of why the decline occurred. I think the third most important reason why post-colonial thinking died was most of the original thinkers literally instrumentalized their ideologies for political domination and control. I think once they got into power, even our very good friends like Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana, once they got into power, then the ideas that they were articulating really ended there pretty much, because the objective was pretty much to gain control. The fourth reason why the ideas declined is that since these ideas were really creatures of specific circumstances, the end of the burning issues, the burning moments that animated African thinking, such as colonialism, neocolonialism, and so on, when they began to decline, I think these ideas invariably began to decline. And so people didn't take very seriously the old clarion calls of aggregating around the notion of how can Africa unite against colonialism when there was no longer colonialism anymore. Henceforth, and this is the major point, as Africa transitions from the kind of individualized, idiosyncratic production of ideas that we associate with the philosopher kings, with the statesmen, African intellectuals began to emerge as the potential new thinkers. And I think this is what I was saying earlier on. African intellectuals begin to take up the place of the former philosopher kings because they are the ones at the forefront of the production of ideas. Next slide, please. The next slide, Kiki. Thanks, thank you. So I thought the entry point into the discussion of Mkandawira is to say Mkandawira is not unique. I think there is some good writing out there around the ideas of Samir Amin, the Egyptian who spent a lot of time in Dakar in an institution that was actually critical to also producing very vibrant ideas. And there's just a recent issue of the Review of African Political Economy that also celebrates Samir Amin's contribution to global knowledge. And I think there's reason to ask on Amin seeking to highlight his academic and activist work that is important for our students of African politics it's important for us to begin to look through and see who else is producing interesting ideas that can be of relevance to our understanding of Africa and the world. So that's why I began to spend some time to begin to look at Mkandawire. Quickly, for those of you who are not familiar with him, he spent his adult life as executive director of the Council for the Development of Social Science Research in Africa, which is based in Dakar, called Codestria, from 1985 to 1996. And then from there, he went to Geneva as the director of the United Nations Research Institute for Social Development, where he also spent quite a number of years from 1998 to 2009, ending up at the London School of Economics from 2009 to 2020. And I'm pointing to these three institutions because my thesis is that these kinds of institutional anchoring gives somebody like Mkandawire the latitude to begin to come up with ideas that are more interesting, not just for policymakers, but also for the larger academic community. And that it is important, therefore, when we begin to look at these intellectuals, we begin to ask the question, where are they based institutionally? And previously, I have done some work that compares Prebisch in ECLA in Latin America and Edozie at the Economic Commission for Africa, where I was looking at to what extent do strong individuals, strong academics, begin to use some of these interesting institutions, such as the UN Commission for Latin America or the UN Commission for Africa. How do they use them, in fact, in creating ideas that then become policy relevant knowledge? As I begin to look at Mkandawire's work, what I'm saying is that we're going to look at him from those three institutional bases, Codestria, and then the UNRCD, and then the London School of Economics, to understand how the institution frames the thinking, but the individual also uses those institutions to begin to think more clearly about policy relevant knowledge. Next slide. So I look at Mkandawire's work as political ideas that are reflections about the world, but they have three major components. I think in my book, to justify as political ideas, they have to have first what I'm calling an inner coherence. That is that these ideas are not just episodic or sporadic, rather they are systematic and there is some logic to these ideas. So I think as I grapple through Mkandawire's work, what I'm already beginning to see is that inner coherence and that logic and that systematic nature of his contribution to ideas and knowledge. Second, I'm also looking for another C that I call consistency. These are ideas that have to build on a very firm core foundation, ideas and knowledge. And I think it is on that firm foundation that you then begin to appreciate how consistent these ideas are. And as I look at Mkandawire's work, I see that, for instance, he resisted the temptation to be captured by the prevailing intellectual fads, or he was not the kind of intellectual who jumped from one paradigm to the other. He remained very much consistent around some key and some core ideas. And that to me, therefore, becomes an interesting area to understand as I look at his contribution to broader global ideas. Thirdly, I think political ideas are powerful when they have conviction, when there is power around them. A lot of us write, we think, but sometimes we don't think with conviction. We don't think with the force of our own ideas. And I see in Mkandawira's work, therefore, that component of conviction, and the writings reveal that he's convinced that what he's putting forward is actually a convincing argument and that it makes sense. So that to me is an important area of analysis of political ideas. Next slide. The other issue that I think we should note before we look at exactly what did he contribute is to say that Mkandawira was a modest man who never claimed to be an original thinker. I think he would be the first person to argue that in fact, there are no new ideas out there. And I think that's important because it does underscore the fact that a lot of the new intellectuals are not really reinventing the wheel in terms of ideas. They are trotting within larger basket of ideas that are already out there, percolating in the global marketplace. So the mark of his contribution, therefore, should lie, or lies to me, in what I'm calling interpretive clarity of existing ideas. How he was able to do it congently to interpret existing and prevailing ideas. And then I argue, therefore, that the clarity of interpretation, the lucidness of interpretation of existing ideas stems partly from his clarity of thinking, that he was very able to explain ideas much, much more clearly, I think, than most of us will struggle with these basic concepts. And I have a quotation there from one of his students. I think when he died, one of his students wrote an obituary where he was arguing that he read his essay on the state and agricultural development in Africa. And he said, he clearly explained to me the nature of the state in Africa, just through one single article, gave these students a very clear sense of what Mkandawira was trying to articulate. Next slide. The major assumption of Mkandawira's thinking was, again, to return back to my earlier discussion on universality vis-a-vis particularism. The major assumption was that while there were universal principles or universal laws that govern social phenomenon, these principles and laws had to be routinely negotiated within specific or particular contexts. And that is why I think if you read his work, you'll see there is a lot of insistence on the importance of history. And history is going to give us some lens into the particularities of the African condition, but the African condition within a larger global condition. And again, I'm insisting here that as he was trying to blend the universal and the particular, this was not particularly novel. And I've already pointed to why he would not think that his ideas were new. But as I said, the interesting component is what did he contribute to the general flow of these ideas. So I'll just point, because of time, I'll just point to some key areas where I think I'm beginning to do research through his writing and beginning to tease out, I think, what are some of the themes from his writings along the metrics that I have already developed, the metric of coherence and consistency and clarity. So the first area that I substantively was his capacity to lend interpretive clarity to the momentous scholarly and policy debates, beginning from the development debates of the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s. And there is a lot of writing where he is using his academic heart to begin to explain all of development thinking in the 60s, the 70s, goes into the 80s in the era of structural adjustment and Africa's contestation with the World Bank and the IMF. Kandawire standing out there as one of really the contributors of what became known as the alternative African position on received wisdom from Washington. So I'm placing his work there in that context of to what extent does a scholar like him come up with very strong ideas that contribute to the articulation of the larger movement called the African alternatives. And people like Edozie, the one I mentioned, Edozie was one of the core thinkers, especially when he was at the UN Economic Commission for Africa in Ethiopia. But Kandawire is part of the whole intellectual contribution to those ideas. Next slide. Second, and this is equally critical. From the institutional vantage point of Codestre and Dakar, Kandawire sought to train and reaffirm the significance of African social scientists as producers of knowledge. And this is important because this institution was created as one that was going to train the next generation of African scientists. And as a director within that institute for many years, he used it very creatively to see that it actually was at the forefront of production of knowledge about Africa, against what he saw as the gatekeeping roles of global and Western Africanists. So it's important, and there is a lot of discussion around that, but I'm just giving you a sense of what that was all about. African social science, he argued, could compete with the global social sciences, and that it should be the role of an institution like Codestre to, in fact, be at the forefront of those debates. So he saw Codestre, therefore, as an effort to create an autonomous space where African intellectuals can reflect on the continent's social and development processes, part of the larger liberation struggle, but in this context, extended to the intellectual sphere. That's actually how what he did when he was at Codestre. Moreover, this task was vital in the context where he argued very variously, where African intellectuals were struggling with repression at home and marginalization abroad. Again, a thesis that comes out very clearly in his writings. Next slide. Thirdly, as he begins to segue to go to Geneva at the UN, he begins to contribute to the global thinking on the momentous questions of the 90s, on the role of the state in the development process. So I just cited one of his articles there, his essay, which I call a seminal essay, Thinking About Developmental States in Africa, which he first presented in the Codestre Congress in 1995, but later on published in 2001 in the Cambridge Journal of Economics, where he argued simply that Africa needed to have both development and democracy, especially in the context where I argue is challenging the pessimism about development in Africa. And he is arguing, in fact, we need to be more optimistic about the possibility of African development, in fact, occur. But I think in the same token, he also challenges African scholars at that very moment, who are quick to jump to the popular bandwagon of developmental dictatorships. And you see that in the writings around early 2000, where everybody is jumping and saying, let's go the China way, let's go to a developmental dictatorship route. And Kandawire is saying, no, let's step back and think more clearly about how we blend democracy and development, and is captured in that essay on thinking about the developmental state. Next slide. Fourth, Kandawira had faith in the ability of African institutions to make a difference at several levels. As I already mentioned, he had a lot of faith in the role of social sciences in Africa to play the role of emancipation. For African intellectuals to emerge and to compete globally and to speak the global language, that would be important, but also for emancipatory purposes. Secondly, he believed that the African state could be configured to better manage the array of African problems. I think if you look at the studies around the African states around this time, a lot of scholars are throwing a lot of bad names around the African state. And Kandawira says, no, I think we should be more cautious. We should look at how these institutions can be re-engineered. They are weak, but they can be re-engineered to serve the African agenda, and that we cannot be pessimistic about them. Similarly, there's a lot of writings that he's done on African regional and continental institutions, and proceeding along the same lines to say, to what extent can these institutions be empowered to promote African integration? Because these are institutions, if they are not there, they will have to be created. They are important in African emancipation and integration. Finally, I think one of the themes that I see in Kandawira's work is a faith and the belief in strong popular movements to propel change. And that fits in with his discussion about the no trade-off between democracy and development. He says democracy is anchored on popular movements, and we need to begin to continually promote or to argue for the centrality of social movements. And as I come to the end, the next slide. I thought what I'll do is to read three quotations from two eminent scholars about Africa and the production of knowledge. And the first one is from Frantz Fanon, where he says, the deeper I enter into the cultures and political cycles, the surer I am that the greatest danger that threatens Africa is the absence of ideology. I think to Fanon, ideas were important. And that if we don't have carriers of ideas, if we don't have thinkers who can think about how to remake the world, then we are in trouble. So I thought it would be a good way to summarize this discussion. But also Walter Rodney, in How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, says the major and first responsibility of the intellectual is to struggle over ideas. Again, the theme around the centrality of ideas, the centrality of thinking. We need to know who is struggling over these ideas. And finally, the Mail and Guardian is a South African weekly newspaper, and I ran across this quotation from it. Somebody is asking, we must encourage the growth of Black intellectuals in the South African context, who can produce discourse to rigorously engage with the transformation of our society. We have seen the decline in Black intellectual production. There is a resulting death of independent and committed Black intellectuals. Again, asking the question that Fanon is asking and Rodney is asking, where are the thinkers, where are the intellectuals that can produce knowledge that is universal, but is also African? Next slide. So tentatively, therefore, my conclusion is that beyond Mkandawire or others, I'm sure there are others, but I just decided to focus on Mkandawire. So beyond Mkandawire, my question, therefore, is where are the intellectuals struggling over ideas in Africa? What is their institutional base? Because most of us are based in universities. We are not in Geneva, or we are not in Dakar with Codestria. Where are we institutionally? And what does this say about the ability of Africans to continue to produce knowledge that is useful, that is understandable, that is relevant? Are they known beyond the narrow confines of academia? I think one way, therefore, to judge what I'm calling the powerful ideas that intellectuals produce, they have to be known beyond the confines of academia. The other question is, therefore, where are the large ideas and policy insights that are informing contemporary thinking around Africa? My final word on Kandawire for now, as I continue with the research, is that he was aware of the persistence of asymmetries in power and ideas, but he was also very much determined through his writings to get his voice heard. By appropriating the language and methods of the North, he sought to make Africa relevant to the world. And I think that's the final word from this end now. The other two, the remaining slides are just some references for people who probably want to understand. The book by Adebayo, the Pan-African Pantheon, I've already alluded to it, but some of those are Mkandawire's writings. And then the final slide is some of the recent works on Samir Amin. So I look at this, therefore, as a collective global enterprise for scholars from Latin America, from North America, from Africa, to begin to look at where is it that we can actually work together in trying to discover some of these ideas and make them relevant to broader global audiences. And I think on that note, I'll stop here. And thank you very much for listening. And I hope we can continue this conversation and pick it back to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm going to stop sharing so we can see everyone and maybe spotlight you, Gilbert, so that we can field the many questions that I'm sure your lecture has provoked and solicited. Thank you very much for that. It's great memory of a beloved but really progressive and post-colonial thinker that was Thandika Mkandawire. May his soul rest in peace, but his work will live on, absolutely. Let me see if there are any questions. I have a few comments myself, but I would love to defer to the audience first. Just looking at the, and we are just getting ready to submit questions now. So I don't have any questions currently in my inbox, but let me ask you, this question, Gilbert. That there used to be a time when we talked about the 4 M's in African intellectual thinkers. Mkandawire was one of them. The other is Mamdani, Mbembe, and the last one was Mudimbe, the great Mudimbe. What do you think about placing Mkandawire's work in relation to those, fascinating, African intellectuals, as well?
Thank you for that question, because I think it's relevant to the understanding of what I call the issue of the institutional anchorage. Mamdani is in Makerere, but mostly in Colombia before then. Mbembe at Visa here in Wits, and Mudimbe mostly I think in North Carolina for many years. The simple answer to it is that all these are great Africanists. All these are great Africans, and that we've benefited tremendously from their knowledge, from their ideas. The only thing that Mkandawire in my book stands out is that he was on the ground for most of the time. I mean, the years he spent at Codestria, and I've just barely touched on that kind of intellectual training, intellectual thinking around African issues from 1985, a very difficult moment in Africa, the 80s being a very difficult moment. So, I think the cop-up answer is he used that institution very creatively to promote what I'm calling an African policy agenda. But I see him doing the same thing when he goes to Geneva. Again, an interesting position to be in. And I'm not complaining about the Mamdanis not having worked for UN institutions, but I'm just saying I don't know whether these kinds of socialization in these institutions makes your ideas a bit different from the ordinary intellectual like Achille Mbembe who is reflecting on the same issues. Like Mudimbe, who is reflecting on this, people like Ali Mazrui, if you wanted to add another M. But they never really had that kind of institutional anchor that allowed them to be thinkers within institutions. And that's what fascinates me about him. And that's why I was saying in my earlier comparative work on Edozie at the ECA and Prebisch at ECLA, it gives me some kind of, comparison on how do you use institutions as an intellectual? How do you transform institutions to be thinking institutions? Right. So, yeah.
Thank you. I see Alicia's hand up, but let me just ask Benjamin's question, and then Alicia, you're next, right? Benjamin's question is that to, I have lots of questions here. Okay, you know what? Alicia, go ahead with your question, and then let me get ready to, after your question, ask the many questions here.
Well, Professor Gilbert, thank you very much and to be here with us. Your talk is so, it is impressing me a lot because I think that the next colloquium, at least, we must have a session about the relation between our thinkers in Latin America and in Africa. You talk about Samir Amin, but we also have, Prebisch, Teotonio dos Santos, Celso Furtado. So we have many thinkers in common. But the way is how we can take those roots that we lost after the Washington Consensus measures. I think we have to rethink again that damage that the Washington Consensus has done in our countries, and all this concept of globalization. And one of the things that for me is most important, because I specialize in financial crisis, is the finalization process of our commodities. That has impact a lot in the development of our countries. So I am very excited. Thank you very much. I would like to continue having more contact with us, but I think that we must, if not for the next third colloquium, because this will be in 2 years, but maybe in few months or maybe at the end of this year, we can have at least 1 or 2 sessions about this, I think we must create a think tank between Latin American and Africans to see what are we going to do after the pandemic? What is the resolution? How are the alternatives? But I will close my microphone. Sorry.
Thank you, Alicia. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Alicia. I think, the interesting thing these days is that you have Zoom, which makes it very easy to organize these meetings. So a follow-up meeting on comparative ideas, I think, is important. There are a lot of gems that we've ignored. When we talk about Samira, their contribution to knowledge, global knowledge, I think these are issues that we need to bring up. And of course, in Latin America, there are many. I was just mentioning Prebish because I got to do some work on him. I used to teach a class on comparative ideas, and I fell in love with Prebish and all that. So let's do it. I think it's easier to organize these forums than it was previously, and we just need some organization. Yeah.
Thank you. All right, I have 3 questions here. I'm going to present them to you so you can write them down one after the other. The first one is from Benjamin Juarez. His question is, has the Anglophone or Francophone colonial legacies made Pan-African dialogues more difficult? And then the next question comes from Jose Luis Gasquez, and his question is, which is the main theoretical contribution of African scholars concerned about epistemological issues, such as Nkandawire or Ndlovu Gatsheni, or is it Francis Nyamon?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. And then the last question is a follow-up from Benjamin, and he asks, could you please talk about Senghor, Leopold Senghor, and the Negritude movement and his criticism, or the criticism that it received in Africa and Europe, as well as his poetic legacy. And then I have some other questions, but take those first, and then we'll go to that.
Yeah, Benjamin, I think the issue around the fragmentation of Africa on linguistic and geographical lines has always been a challenge when it comes to forging common idioms common language to talk about Africa. And these are realities of colonialism. But I think over the years, this has been transcended through a lot of interaction across the Francophone, the Anglophone, the Lusophone. They still remain very much part of us. But we've tried to negotiate around these language differences, of course, through translations, through exchanges. So it used to be a big problem, I think, previously, but it's no longer as a bigger problem as now. I think these issues have been surmounted partially by technology, but I think just by the density of cross-fertilization of ideas around Africa. But also, if I answer your second question on Senghor, again, that's why this book that I was recommending on the Pantheon on Pan-Africanism, the movement on the cultural renaissance that Senghor began has never really actually died away. Even in South Africa here, in the post-apartheid period, there are discussions around the African Renaissance and how South Africa should go back to the old ideas of Senghor, of Nkrumah, of Nyerere. And culture is significant because culture is what gives the cement to all these political ideas. So Senghor's Negritude was a powerful movement that actually paved the way for the start of these other ideas around political identity. You can't politically identify if you're not culturally comfortable with yourselves. So these are debates that are still very, very much with us. In the new and current movements around decolonization of education and all that, culture is very central because it's, as I said, is the foundation to all forms of identity, political or cultural. So Senghor remains very much part of that whole debate on how does Africa identify itself and how can it regenerate. Jose, I think, is mentioning some of the gems that I've been talking about. There are a lot of African thinkers, African philosophers who've been writing, who are still writing, but we often do not appreciate their works, maybe because we don't know them. So I was glad when you mentioned Namjo, for instance, from the Cameroonian from the University of Cape Town. Written quite a lot of interesting material. So there is a lot of good intellectual contribution by people like Achille, as you mentioned, and there are others. There are
and
other
forget
scholars.
the women. The women.
Yeah.
Let's not forget the women.
There are a lot of women writers in the book that I was pointing at. We have even unknown people like Michelle Mugo,
Yes.
who very few people would know about. But the question, therefore, is that when we are interested in African generation of knowledge, we then have to begin look for these ideas. We have a lot of women authors, we have a lot of women writers, we have a lot of intellectual philosophers coming out, people like Sabelo Dlovu that you mentioned, Gasheni, who is now writing from the perspective of the post-colonial movement. And Gasheni was here with us in South Africa, but he's now moved to Germany. So again, we've exported him to the north to propound those ideas of decoloniality and so on. So there is quite a rich tradition of African thinking that transcend the continent. And that's why I like the idea of beginning to explore what are the linkages, what are the continental linkages on the production of the production of ideas that may not necessarily be African. These are global ideas that resonate in Africa, they resonate in Latin America, they resonate in Europe, in Asia. So I think there's a lot that we can do. I think I've answered the three thus far.
Thank you. I have one here. The question, I'm not sure if it's by my colleague Pearl Robinson, if she's in the space. Hi, Pearl. But the question says, Pearl Robinson, don't you think part of Kandawire's impact was his relationship with younger African scholars based on the continent? Codestria was a transgenerational enterprise. That's that question. And because of time, I'm going to read the next question also, Gilbert, if you don't mind. And that's Falu Ngom's question. Also, so it's a follow-up to Pearl Robinson's question. Also, the non-Europhone African writers who write in Arabic and African languages use Arabic scripts. Change it quickly. Use African scripts who also challenged Arab and Arabic hegemony. So he wants you to speak to, how do we bridge the non-Europhone and Europhone writers of Africa? And the last question, I promise you, Gilbert, is, Gilbert, beyond questions of African cultural and political identity, what in your estimation is the most important contribution of African intellectuals to thinking about the evolution of colonial and post-colonial agriculture? Thank you for your questions all.
Thank you, Paul. Good to see you. Good to know you're in the audience. And I think you've touched on my previous question, which was Mkandawire's vantage point at Codestria. His advantage that he was able to create and fashion an African institution to actually use it more creatively, not just for the training of African intellectuals and African scholars, but also to use that pedestal of Codestria as a way to challenge existing knowledge. I think a lot of our thinkers don't have that advantage, and we have to be very clear. Even Samir Amin, in Dakar, just spending all those years in Dakar, that kind of contribution becomes much more unique than for those of us ordinary mortals who are in universities and struggling to survive as academics with tenure and all those. But you have an institution like Codestria, which Kandawira uses to mold and to create the social science that is important and relevant, that he argued was important for Africa's liberation. So I think that's what makes him different from the other scholars. And I mean, I don't want to talk about Codestria beyond Kandawira, but I'm just saying it remains an important institution. And maybe the bigger point to make is we need more of those kinds of institutions where African scholars have the liberty, have the resources to think, but also to create, to socialize the next generation of African scholars, to begin to do the kind of thinking that we are talking about. The second question on North Africa, I think when I was answering the the question about the Lusophone, Francophone, and Anglophone, I should have mentioned that in fact, North Africa is very much part of Africa. But yes, the main cultural divide, the major cultural divide for now remains the North and the Sub-Saharan component of Africa. So we have not done as well. We have not done as well in reaching out to North African scholars. And I would say the same thing about North African scholars. They have not done as much in reaching out to the rest of the continental scholars, especially around these big ideas that we are talking about. How do we promote African thinking? How do we articulate African thinking around the world? And that divide is also linguistic. A lot of our people around here speak some French, they speak some Portuguese, but very few of them speak Arabic. So we should be doing more, I think, in bridging that divide. And I think we need to say, as the new generations, or rather after the NASAs and so on, we are the generation that should actually cure those divides. I meet a lot of our North African, Algerian, Egyptian colleagues at AU meetings and so on. But there are very few meetings between African institutions and North African institutions. But I think we need to do more.
Gilbert, we have about 1 minute.
What is Africa's intellectual contribution to issues around post-colonialism? I think part of the discussion of the post-colonial thinking from the Nyereres, from the Nkrumahs, from the Senghor, was to lay the foundation for the thinking around what is Africa going to look like after independence. So there's a lot of writings in that area. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Gilbert Khadiagala. Thank you so much for an invigorating lecture on African intellectualism transcontinentally. Thank you so much. And that brings an end to our opening keynote. I believe I am now going to transition back to Alicia, who will, open the